From the earliest times, London has been the literary centre of Britain. Books, plays, papers and journals have all come forth from the presses and publishers of the city. Londoners have a voracious appetite for news and the written word. That thirst for knowledge has helped drive the publishing industries and made London a city of letters. Today you can go out into the high street and buy newspapers, magazines, books. In other words, we take the printed word for granted. But 1,000 years ago, things were very different. The only way of getting words onto parchment was like this, with a quill pen. And that was a slow, laborious process. First you had to catch your goose, and then you take the feathers from the left wing, which meant they curl comfortably for the right-handed writer. And then you trim them with your penknife, pen from the Latin penna for feather, and then you start writing like this. It takes ages. To write out a whole book like a Bible would take years, which meant that books were very rare and indeed very expensive. But that didn't really matter too much because very few people could read. Printing arrived in Europe in 1440, when a German called Johannes Gutenberg started making Bibles, and there are still Gutenberg Bibles around today. His printing press was based on the grape and olive presses already around at the time, only now he was producing words rather than wine or oil. The process spread across Europe and arrived in London in 1476, thanks to William Caxton, who was a successful wool merchant. He turned his hand to translating works from French into English, and he was the first person to print a book in the English language. In one of London's quiet alleyways can be found a building that houses a treasure trove of old printing presses and sets of type in many different typefaces. Here are all the tools of the printing trade. I've come to the St Bride Library just off Fleet Street because here they know all about printing, and the librarian is Nigel Roach. Nigel, what was the impact of printing when it started?
Oh, it massively increased the number of books which were available in Europe.
Right, OK, mass production in other words.
Mass production within its age.
Now, Caxton was the bloke who brought it here. What did he print?
He printed for the top of the social triangle, for the king and the nobility. That's the market he was going for.
Saucy foreign stories?
Oh, slightly saucy, but The Legend of Good Women doesn't sound that saucy.
Ah.
But if you are thinking of the mass production of popular literature, I think you have to look to his successor, Wynkyn de Worde. After Caxton's death, he moved his equipment up here to Fleet Street about 1500, and he's known as the father of Fleet Street.
Ah, so that was the first printing press in Fleet Street?
Yes, the first actually in Fleet Street.
Oh, wonderful. Anyway, could we do a bit of printing?
We could, yes. I mean, over there we can do something.
Right. Now, can I put the last few letters in?
Yes, they're here.
OK. Are they brass, these letters?
No, these bigger ones are wood. The smaller ones down the bottom there are lead and tin and antimony. Now, secure it with these wedges.
That's tightening that up there, right. So it's not going to move?
That's right. Now,
all right.
Time to ink it.
We need ink, don't we?
I can offer you the sort of thing that Caxton used,
right,
or the 19th century equivalent.
Well, let me try this. This is leather, is it?
Yes.
And you've got ink on it?
It's already inked, so...
Sort of like that?
That's right.
Right, let me try the roller for the others.
Maybe prefer the roller.
I would say the roller is easier. So is this the sort of press that Caxton would have used?
It's very similar in its mechanical principles. Caxton's press would have been made of wood. This is the same sort of thing made in iron.
OK, can I put the paper on?
Pop it on.
Well, I reckon...
Position it nicely.
About there. This goes down.
That's it. Close it down.
And then winch it underneath, yes?
In, that's right. And then you'll see the printing happening.
Somewhere like that.
Good.
And then pull the lever.
That's it. And don't forget to dwell at this end. So
for how long?
Actually, a few seconds.
Is that long enough?
That's fine. So that the ink transfers to the paper.
Right, and then wipe this out again.
Out. Let's see what you've done.
Made a mess, I expect. That's usually what I do. Well, it's still there. Are you ready? Oh, look at that. Not bad. Oh, hey. Oh, that's very neat. How London was built. So what sort of type is this?
That's exactly the sort of type that Caxton used. It's a 15th century Gothic used in one of his books.
It's quite difficult to read, isn't it?
They would have thought that it was really very easy to read.
Really?
That's what they were familiar with. They would have found it more difficult to read this.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Great. Oh, I've printed something. The increase in printed materials meant that knowledge and information became available to a wider group of people. However, books were still relatively expensive, so that only the rich could afford them. A historian and essayist called Thomas Carlyle reckoned that Londoners would benefit from a major independent library. Of course, there was the reading room at the British Museum, but that was noisy and crowded, and you had to consult books on the spot. Carlyle envisaged a place where you could read books in a quiet reading room, or even take them away and read them in your own home. So, in 1841, the London Library was formed, originally in offices down there in Pall Mall. But then it moved up here to St James's Square and now occupies a discreet building in the corner of the square built in 1898. One of the most extraordinary things about this building is the construction of the book stacks. You see all these steel frames which are open so the light from here goes down to the floors below. There are actually 7 floors of book stacks. The whole thing is built on a steel frame, so that the weight of the books is taken not on the walls, but on the frame itself. It's a very interesting and innovative use of steel. The whole library was designed to reflect the domestic feel of its former homes. So there's lovely wooden panelling, there are portraits on the walls, there's a beautiful fireplace here and these comfortable armchairs. In fact, I once came in here after a very good lunch and had an hour's sleep and nobody complained. The library has been used by many famous authors over the years, from Tennyson and Virginia Woolf to Salman Rushdie and Alan Bennett. And there are some wonderful relics of their use here. These 4 books were actually consulted by Charles Dickens when he was writing A Tale of Two Cities, and they're still on the open stacks. I could take them out today, the very same volumes. And this I particularly like. This is an application form for life membership from George Bernard Shaw. It's dated the 12th of September 1943, and he writes on the form, "My wife, who was a life member, died this morning. As I'm in my 87th year, I shall not survive for long." And basically he's asking for a discount, which they didn't give him. And he became a life member and he lived for another 7 years. So actually, perhaps he didn't deserve it anyway. The Victorians bought books too, like these penny dreadfuls, tales of intrigue and adventure, the equivalent of today's airport thrillers. They were also avid readers of newspapers. But the news industry was already 150 years old, and hundreds of papers and journals were available in the capital. Some, like the Times and the Observer, started their lives 220 years ago. Nowadays, news is available on every street corner, and we're just as addicted as we ever were. This is the Evening Standard, literally hot off the press, and within the hour, these bundles of copies will be out on the streets ready for sale. Nowadays, all the printing happens in the east of the city, but there was a time when it happened right in the heart. For over 500 years, Fleet Street and its surrounding alleys were the heart of all the major printing in London. All the big newspapers were based here, and the scramble for news went on by night and day. This extraordinary building across the road, which has been called the Black Lubyanka, was built by Owen Williams in 1932 for the Daily Express. It has a unique concrete structure which allows for much greater floor space, and it meant that the huge printing presses down in the basement had plenty of room. He also designed the M1 motorway, but on the whole I think this looks better. This is also one of London's first and arguably finest examples of curtain walling. The walls aren't structural at all, they're all made of glass and they're just hung on the outside of the building. And that was absolutely intentional. They wanted to show that all night the journalists were slaving away inside and all the lights blazing because they had to get the news out in the morning. Outside, the building may be minimal and elegant, but here in the lobby, it's exactly the opposite. This is the first thing that visitors would see when they came into the building. Look at these silver serpents, and look at the floor, which looks like waves. I'm almost wading through them. And I have to wade through them to get to the empire. These extraordinary murals, one at each end, represent the industry of the empire. People slaving away, carrying buckets, wielding swords, you name it, they're doing it. Even when they went up, they were recognised as being hopelessly jingoistic and over the top. But the fact is, the Daily Express was selling 3 million copies every day, and they could afford to show off a bit. Just have a look at that ceiling. London has always been seen as a literary centre, home to dramatists, novelists, the writer of the first English dictionary, Dr. Johnson, and many other writers from George Eliot to Shakespeare. However, the printing revolution had long been missing one crucial element, the mechanisation of papermaking. For hundreds of years, books were written on handmade paper. This was expensive and very time-consuming to produce. Paper was first made in this country around 1500, and in those days it was all made by hand, and they started with cotton rags. What you actually need is any source of cellulose, and today they use a lot more wood pulp, and in between they've used all sorts of things like esparto grass. Basically it's a source of cellulose which will give you the fibres which will knit together to make the paper. What we're doing today is using old school paper which has been chewed up and is going to be recycled. You mix it with water into a sort of sludge, and then you put your sludge in a big tank of water, and that's where you make your paper from. And what I'm going to do is to lift some of those fibres out on a nylon mesh, which has actually got my ugly mug sewn into it like that. It's going to make a watermark in the paper. First of all, I dip that very carefully and then lift it up to capture some of the pulp on top of my mesh. Then turn the whole thing over, and this is quite scary, onto this bit of hand towel. So that first process was the forming, and now the pressing. So I take a sponge and I squeeze gently, which is compressing the fibres together and also taking out some of the water. Now with luck, if I lift that out, it will all come away from the mesh, and you'll find here a not very beautiful piece of paper with, look, it's got my ugly mug on it. And in fact, that needs to dry. We'll use a hot plate, but in the old days they hung them all up. And what you wind up with is something like that. Isn't that terrific? This method of making paper was slow, and sheets were limited to the largest size of frame a man could carry. In 1802, mechanisation was introduced into the process when two London stationers, the Foudrinier brothers, introduced the world's first paper machine. It may look primitive, but this was the beginning of a great industry. This is Frogmore Mill in Apsley, just outside London. It's home to Britain's oldest working paper mill. I've come down now to see the big Foudrinier machine, and I'm with Mike Stanion, who knows about how it works. They're just getting up steam. Mike, before it starts going, tell me how it works.
Well, first of all, the pulp comes down at this end onto this is called the wire.
And this is the same as that little mesh I was using?
More or less the same as that, yes.
Okay.
But very quickly, the liquid drains through. It goes underneath, and it's pumped back upstairs to be recycled for the next batch.
Right.
The water is sucked out, and then it passes under this rotating dandy roll, which smooths the surface of the paper.
Ah, so it's less lumpy than mine was.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
And here we have the press roll. This was what you were doing with the sponge.
Oh, the sponge.
Yes, this is actually the press.
So it's like a mangle.
Absolutely. And then it passes through here into the drying section, where there's 20 odd cylinders, all heated by steam to help evaporate the rest of the water that's in the paper.
Where does the steam come from?
That is the exhaust from the steam engine, which is actually driving the whole of the machine.
It's all driven by steam engine?
Absolutely.
Oh, wonderful. And so you're recycling the steam to heat the rollers, all 20 of them. That's terrific. Now, tell me about these things here.
That is a Mulready envelope. This one is 170 years old. It's a
170
piece of paper
Wow.
from the very first postal system in this country. They're made at the next mill down by a man called John Dickinson. He was around right at the time when the penny post was being introduced. And this was pre-printed, so you went to the post office, you bought your envelope for 2p, you then wrote
on the back.
the inside,
Yes. And then just folded it up so it becomes its own envelope.
you then sent it off and it was delivered. But they were afraid at the time that people were going to forge these things because anyone could print them.
Just the stamp was on it.
Because the
Yes.
stamp, right. So what they did was they inserted into the paper while it was wet in the machine some threads of silk.
Oh, yes.
And you can see
You
that-
can see them there, yes.
Yeah. And that was an anti-forgery idea.
Very clever. And did that idea catch on?
Yes, it's still going today. If you've got some money,
Money?
some notes.
Me?
Yes.
Well, I do happen to have one note here, yes. Oh, so you mean this metal strip?
That little strip derived from this idea.
Oh, that's very clever,
Yes.
isn't it? Thank you very much indeed. With the advances in paper making, printing and literacy came the necessity to keep copies of all printed works, from penny dreadfuls to Shakespeare. And one place that held a copy of everything was the library at the British Museum, our first true national library. People would come to consult books inside the huge domed reading room built in the museum's great court. When the library moved to new premises in the 90s, the museum decided to renovate and open up the courtyard to the public. This is the great court of the British Museum. 150 years ago, the Crystal Palace, built for the Great Exhibition of 1851, had been such a success, they were going to put a glass roof right over the top, but it never happened until the year 2000. And finally they did it, and the chap responsible was Steve Brown. It almost looks as if it could have been done in one piece. Did you try that?
It can't be one piece because it's 72 metres wide and 95 metres long, and it's very hard
That's
to
a big
move it
piece of
because
glass.
It's a big piece.
Yes.
But it acts as one piece, and it all works like a card. A card is stiff, and if you try and bend it, it pops back again.
Right.
But if you actually fold the card,
Right.
you have one piece, which is the roof,
Right.
and this thing goes from the reading room across to the quadrangle building around the edge.
Are you telling me this is flexible, this roof?
It is, it's flexible. It moves every day, in and out. As the sun comes up, it grows. As the sun goes in, it shrinks.
Oh, amazing. By how much?
Well, about 20 millimetres in breadth, and it goes up and down by about 10. And it does it so that we're able to preserve the historic nature of the quadrangle building around the Great Court, but also the reading room in the middle. What we couldn't do was have the roof lean or push against it. So we put sliding bearings all the way around here, so the whole roof slides on the roof on the existing buildings.
Wonderful. Isn't it like an oven in here in the summer when the sun shines?
We're in the summer now, and there's a couple little tricks to it.
Yes.
First thing, it's double glazed. Also, there's a ceramic frit based on the glass.
Fritz?
It's a little, like a ceramic dot on top of the glass,
Right.
which allows only 35% of the light to get into the space.
Really?
We also control the temperature using the floor. If you touch the floor now, you'll feel it's cold. We're in the
Right.
summertime, and in the summertime we pump cold water through the floor to actually chill the floor. And in the winter, we reverse that process, and we pump warm water through the floor.
Oh,
So
that's
it
very
warms
neat.
it. So the area that we're all standing in, the bottom 2 metres, remains very temperate. Up the top, where nobody is, we can all look at it, but the temperature is quite different.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it gets quite warm up there in the summer.
The books may have left Bloomsbury and the British Museum, but they are now housed in the new British Library, the largest public building constructed in the 20th century. A book is published every 30 seconds, which means that 1 million new books a year are added to these stacks, and that doesn't include magazines and journals. After decades of planning, the British Library opened in 1997. The architect, Sandy Wilson, was very keen on things nautical, and if you look, it's very much like a ship. It's got a funnel, and a bridge, and all the way around here, the bows sticking out over the Euston Road. And look, there's even a porthole. And if you look above the porthole, that's the Midland Hotel next to St Pancras Station, famously Victorian Gothic. But the brick is almost the same colour as this. And that's because Sandy deliberately got clay from the same quarry, so that the bricks are identical colour in the British Library as they are in the Midland Hotel. In fact, even the slates on the roof are the same. It's a wonderful match, even though the style of the building is so different. There are 9 reading rooms where people can come and consult books and other materials. The library also houses some pretty impressive treasures, such as the Magna Carta, the first Shakespeare folio, the Beatles song lyrics, and the last words of Captain Scott. This building is absolutely vast. There are 625 kilometres of shelves, and every year they grow by 12 more kilometres. It's amazing. So, where are all the books? Well, most of them are underground. Below the surface, there are 4 more floors completely full of books. It's a bit like an iceberg. Most of this building is invisible to the naked eye. There are over 150 million items in the collections, ranging from books, journals, plates and maps, to posters, photos, and even a lock of Napoleon's hair. Items can be ordered upstairs or online. The requests are sent down to the basement, where books are fetched and dispatched to the required reading room. Every day, a hidden network of conveyor belts transports thousands of books around the building. There are over 6,000 possible routes. Whatever you need to know, from the latest news in particle physics to the colour of Napoleon's hair, the British Library is the place to come, the ultimate resource for Londoners. This enormous building represents the thirst for knowledge and understanding that have really made this city great.